let's move on to our next speaker, Jerry Vila, was about the life and discoveries of Galileo. Go ahead, Jerry.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about Galileo Galilei, inventor, physicist, and astronomer. He was born in Pisa, Italy in 1564, 20 years after the publication of Copernicus on the revolutions. I hope you can see me as well, because I'm just looking at the slides. As a student, Galileo was interested in priesthood, but was pressured by his study medicine. In 1583, 19-year-old Galileo entered the University of Pisa, but he never seemed to have taken medical studies seriously. Instead, he attended courses in mathematics, physics, and natural philosophy. Due to financial difficulties, Galileo left the University of Pisa in 1505 without completing his medical degree. Now, here is the picture of Galilei. After leaving the university, Galileo continued to study mathematics and supported himself with minor teaching positions. During this time, he also began 2-decade study on objects in motion and published The Little Balance, where he described the hydrostatic principle. Now, there are some popular distortions about Galileo, and maybe I can address them here now. Galileo did not invent telescope, but he understood it once he saw an example of it, and he improved it and used it well for celestial observations. While the Galileo was prosecuted by Roman Catholic Church, he recanted to save himself. Didn't want to end up as Giordano Bruno. Galileo indeed used many experiments, and I will touch on some of them as we go through this PowerPoint presentation. But the most important were his thought experiments. Since he lived in a time where senses were aided by rudimentary apparatus, he had no timepiece more accurate than his pulse. Galileo found that reason and bold speculation had to step in rather often to bridge the empirical data. There is one of these thought experiments. If a ball is cut in half, each half should soar, according to Aristotle. But reasoned Galileo, what happens if the two halves are connected by a thread or a stick? The Aristotle physics of falling body cannot be correct. This was, by the way, demonstrated by the Apollo astronaut of the airless moon using a feather hammer. Here Galileo is dropping objects from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, demonstrate that items of the unequal weight fall at the same rate of acceleration. Well, that's kind of a popular image. Well, the experiment would not work very well owing to the air resistance. The heavier, denser object would have hit the ground first. Although a cannonball and a musket ball would fall at the same speed. Here is in the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I am trying to hold on to it. It started to lean as early as it was being built. And this is, of course, a site. I just would like to point out that in the city of Pisa, there are many beautiful buildings rather than this one right here. You can see right in front of you, that's the baptistry. Behind it in the middle, and towards the edge is the Tower of Pisa, which is really a bell tower for the cathedral. 1589, Galileo found a new position at University of Padua, which is west of Venice, northern Italy, teaching geometry, mechanics, and astronomy. The appointment was fortunate for him, since his father died in 1591, leaving Galileo entrusted with the care of his younger brother. During his 18-year tenure at Padua, he gave entertaining lectures and attracted large crowds of followers, further increasing his fame and his sense of mission. Now, the different subjects that Galileo studied, he experiment, of course. He studied speed and velocity, gravity, free fall, the principle of relativity, inertia, projectile motion. He also worked in applied science and technology, describing the properties of pendulums and hydrostatic balances, inventing the thermoscope and various military, and using his telescope for observations of celestial objects. Now, this is a modern version of thermoscope that you can purchase in a gift shops. And on your right-hand side is a reconstruction of Galileo telescope. As you can see, it's a reflector. Reflector hasn't been invented yet. In 1609, Galileo demonstrated his first telescope to Venetian lawmakers, including the Doge of Venice. Venice has no walls. It is protected by water, and there are a number of islands. And the Venetians needed it to see if their cargo ships or enemy ships were approaching. That was their defense, their trade. At the time, Galileo studied mechanics and astronomy at the University of Padua, which was part of the Venetian Republic. If you take a car, it's about an hour drive, or maybe 1.5 hours. And because here is the famous picture of Venice, Laguna. There are several islands. On your right, you can see the Doge's Palace. And here is the St. Mark's Bell Tower in Venice. And many of the observations were done from the top of the bell tower right here. There is another picture I took. There is, at the background is the St. Mark's Basilica. And here at the middle is again the bell tower of Venice. Here the Galileo is demonstrating his to Doge again in Venice 1609. This painting seems to demonstrate that it was watching at night, watching the skies. A year after the demonstration of his telescope, Galileo published Starry Messenger. That would be in 1610. The publication suited the heliocentric system, which describe findings made with his improved telescope. Here, Venus has phases like our moon. He also observed Jupiter for moons, Saturn rings, and innumerable stars. He also did a painting based on the telescopic details of moon that's shown on this slide in the upper end. And at the lower end, you can see the 4 major satellites of Jupiter that sort of line up. And of course, that led to another discovery that not everything orbits around the Earth, which we know. The upper picture here are the rings of Saturn as seen by Galileo. It looks like, for what he could tell from his telescope at the beginning of 17th century, is that the Saturn had ears. And from the movement of sunspots, the part of this slide, he concluded the sun was spinning and the Earth was in an orbit around the sun. If you study those spots for a prolonged period of time, you can see how they are shifting, and that's caused by the orbit of Earth around the sun. Well, Galileo's support for heliocentric system met with opposition from Catholic Church and from some astronomers. I guess that doesn't include us, right? The matter was investigated by the Roman Inquisition in 1615. And that would be the painting on your right-hand side. Well, the Inquisition concluded that heliocentric or Copernicus system was foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it contradicts the Holy Scripture. The painting, the Galileo here, and the Jesuit. Back in 17th century, religion was a center of the everyday life. And this changed since then somewhat. There is another illustration of the phases of Venus to prove that the Venus lies closer to the Sun than Earth. Galileo recognized that his observations supported Nicolaus Copernicus' theory that the planets revolve around the Sun. His advocacy of the theory culminated in his last publication, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernicus. And that was in 1632. Well, Galileo Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World System was published in 1632, as I said, and it appeared to attack Pope Urban VIII. This time, he alienated both the Pope and the Jesuits, that up to a point were somewhat on his side. Well, he was tried by the Inquisition again in 1633. Was found guilty and vehemently suspect of heresy. He was forced to recant and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. That house arrest wasn't so difficult necessarily. He had a servant, he lived in a nice house. And there Galileo died in 1642 at the age of 77. The Renaissance was in full swing, of course, but the Middle Ages still ruled. Here is Galileo facing the Roman Inquisition at that second trial at 1633. And that's one of the painting here. And I have a note here. In 1987, John Paul II, he was known also as a Polish Pope, canonized new saints and also stated the prosecution of Galileo was not just. Well, I guess we figured that out by then. This time the new saints were from the Central Europe. They were not necessarily Italians or French. And many people from there, from Central Europe, visited Rome for the first time. And that was a big demonstration. By 1989, 2 years after, the Berlin to Bulgaria and the Soviet Union 2 years later, in 1991. So it tells you something. It was not necessarily that all the people suddenly started to believe in the Roman Catholic faith, but I guess they just didn't want to believe and being told what to do anymore. Now I will switch to Galileos Private. In 1600, Galileo met Marina Gamba, a Venetian woman who bore him 3 children out of wedlock, daughters Virginia and Livia and son Vincenzo. He never married Marina, possibly due to the financial worries, and yet he feared his illegitimate children would threaten his social standing. Galileo was concerned that his daughters would not marry well and had them enter a convent in 1616. His older daughter, Virginia, there's a picture here, changed her name to Maria Celeste. She remained in contact with him through letters until her death. And his son birth was eventually legitimized and he became a successful musician. Now I will go to Maria Celeste here. And why? Because the letter she sent to Galileo were saved. Maria Celeste was a very devoted daughter, and her letter from the convent survived. The letters are collected in the book, Galileos Daughter. I would highly recommend this publication, this book. I read it. And it opens a curtain on a life in the 17th century. So if you have a chance, go to the library to pick it up. Unfortunately, Galileo's letters to her daughter, to Maria Celeste, were destroyed in the convent when Maria Celeste died. Actually, reading through these letters, I have a personal opinion that her premature death was caused by starvation. Galileo Galilei wrote, "The great book of nature is written in mathematical language. In 1648, under the house arrest, and throughout his life, he was busy observing the stars, his scientific experiments. He is buried in Cathedral of Santa Maria de Fiore in Florence. And this is the picture of the famous cathedral. This one is very famous and popular with tourists. And again, I would like to mention there are many other churches in Florence and museums as well. Is or a monument on a tomb of Galileo Galilei in the Basilica on Fiore in Florence. Galileo was originally buried in the Noviet Chapel that is connected to the Basilica. Nearly 100 years later, however, his admirers were able to exert enough influence and spend enough money for the elaborate monument that would be put right in the Basilica. That's the one here on the right. His body was exhumed and moved there in 1737. One interesting aspect of the tomb is its location. It is directly across from the tomb of Michelangelo, who died within a few days of Galileo's birth. Some say that spot was chosen because there was a popular belief that Michelangelo's spirit left his body and went to Galileo. Another interesting aspect of the tomb is that there are two bodies inside. One is the body of Galileo, the other is the body of his daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, who was writing him all these letters. When Galileo was exhumed to be moved, the body that was so was of a woman. Galileo's body was found underneath the woman's body. It turns out that his pupil, one of his pupils, had secretly buried Galileo's daughter there in the first grave as a posthumous gift to him. As a result, both bodies now rest in the tomb. One final note, when Galileo's body was moved, his admirers took 3 fingers, a tooth and a vertebrae as a keepsake or relics, and they are on displayed in Padua and Florence. Well, I guess we would find the relics, religious or otherwise, rather odd in our century, but these religious relics were important. In Middle Ages, a church would not be built unless they would have a relic to put in it. So the religious relics were important at the time. This presentation I prepare is a small tribute to a man, Galileo Galilei, who changed our world by introducing science to our lives. We should remember him on some occasions. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you allow me, or if you can now, we can watch Galileo's experiment video, please. Thank you.
Well, in my left hand, I have a feather, and in my right hand, a hammer. And well, I guess one of the reasons we got here today was because of a gentleman named Galileo a long time ago, who made a rather significant discovery about falling objects and gravity fields. And we thought where would be a better place to confirm his findings than on the moon. And so we thought we'd try it here for you. The feather happens to be appropriately a falcon feather for our falcon, and I'll drop the two of them here, and hopefully they'll hit the ground at the same time. How about that? And that proves that Mr. Galileo was correct in his findings.
Superb, Dave.
Well, I always say there's nothing like a little science on the moon.
All right. Thank you very much, Jerry, for sharing this with us. And let's go to questions for Jerry.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. There were a few people who were actually commenting on Galileo's vision. He went blind due to looking at the sun and sunspots, but it's been clarified that he used different types of telescopes and he used the camera obscura.
Right.
A question that was raised, though, Jerry, by Cicely, did the younger brother of Galileo make any significant contributions to any field of scientific study?
Well, thank you for the question, but maybe it's my answer. I do not know. I haven't researched that.
Okay, no worries. And I have a question for you, and again, this might be tricky. I've been really curious if Galileo, with his new instruments, might have been able to observe the 1623, I'm not sure if I've got the year right, but the Great Conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. Now we know that those two planets were much closer to the sun, so maybe could not have been seen in the bright sky or in the glare of the sun, but probably leading up to the conjunction proper or after it, there would have been opportunities to observe it. So my question to you, Jerry, is do you know if Galileo's his notebooks or his observations are available to the public? Could one sort of search them and review them?
There is a lot to find on the internet these days. I haven't really came across that conjunction, but there was a great observation in his days about and supernova at that time. And those were rather revealing, and they stir up lots of enthusiasm about it. But I am not sure, I haven't come across the conjunction of those planets.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like there was much observation, and certainly there weren't a lot of telescopes around at that time. So
yeah, the telescope, sorry. The telescope was in its infancy, and the number of limited telescopes, and they would be only available at the time in Europe, for all we know. Kepler asked Galileo if he can send him a telescope, and Galileo unfortunately did not reply to his letter. Kepler would be able to do fantastic observations because he had a theory very well worked out, and he had a telescope because one of the nobles from Germany visited in Prague, and he lended the telescope to Kepler. Kepler was very impressed with the telescope. He immediately understood the principle of the optics, but he couldn't find good optical objectives to put the telescope together. And he wrote a letter to Galileo. And what I know, Galileo didn't really answer positively to his request. He says it's too much work, and he was making the telescope for the nobles who would pay him well, so he didn't send the telescope to Kepler. I don't know whether that answers your questions, but that's what I came across.
Okay, thanks, Jerry, for all the great info. Appreciate the talk.